Last June, Denise Ordway, Denise, you in the house? I saw you a minute ago. Yep. Nieman Fellow from 2015 posted the...
What did you guys serve at lunch?
Posted the following on our all-class Facebook page. Dear Nieman Nation, all of us, I am certain, have seen examples of our journalist friends and colleagues sharing their opinions in public forums about prominent issues of the day and the people involved, even when those issues and people are directly related to their beats and newsroom roles. Over the past 6 months, I've seen journalists even take action, participating in protests and helping raise money in support of causes and people they cover. Aren't these violations of the most basic journalism principles? If so, why do I not see anyone calling these journalists out? Am I alone in my frustration on this issue, or is this behavior okay now? The first response came quickly from one of Denise's classmates, Maggie Kurth-Baker. I want to push back a little on this, Maggie began, articulating a thoughtful argument about the differences between fairness and neutrality. She ended, I'm not sure what the right answer is, but I think it's a good thing to keep talking about. We thought so too. An issue that many journalists believe settled has reemerged, brought on in part by the evolving rhetorical norms of social media and strident attacks on journalists that may tempt certain behaviors. I've heard conversations about this at Nieman in the last 2 years that I hadn't in previous years. And journalists like Denise and Maggie thoughtfully questioning where journalism ends and activism begins. Not long ago, I checked in with a recent Harvard graduate, a very gifted student journalist from the Crimson who I'd gotten to know. She'd gotten a great reporting job out of college, but then quit it to do political work. She felt restricted by the neutrality conventions of journalism at the same time that she admired them and didn't want to trespass. I mentioned last night that Marty Baron has said famously, we're not at war, we're at work, rejecting characterizations of the media as an opposition party. And we wanted to push further on that at-work notion and what exactly it means in the political context, not just of this country, but in so many regions where our fellows and other journalists are enduring new levels of attack by those they cover. So to do that, we've gathered a really terrific group. Their bios are in your programs, but I'm just going to really quickly welcome Steve Engelberg, who was the founding managing editor of ProPublica and became editor-in-chief in 2013. John Harwood, a Nieman Fellow in arguably the best class, who's editor-at-large for CNBC in Washington, and who I've talked to him about what I see as sort of an evolving voice on his Twitter, at least. And Samhita Mukhopadhyay, who's executive editor of Teen Vogue, and I hope you have, or if you haven't, you will read the story we've done on this issue and posted up on Nieman Reports, in which we quote her. I think, as many of you know, Teen Vogue became really very prominent in this discussion for a really noticeable turn that the magazine took under her leadership and that of others, and really a very prominent voice for the generation that they serve. And then very fortunately, we are moderating today is Indira Lakshmanan, who is, of course, a Nieman Fellow as well, and is now executive editor of the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting in Washington. Please join me in welcoming them.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much for coming, everybody. And I want to sort of start this conversation, which is a debate that I think is going on in every newsroom, at least in the United States, for the last 2 years. And I certainly will be curious to hear from our audience when we're doing the Q&A how much this same topic is resonating outside of the U.S. Oh, first let me say that Samhita is going to have to dash out a little bit early because she has a train back to New York for another event. She's very in demand. So don't think anything weird is happening. She just will have to slip out a little early.
I'm like so offended I walk off.
It's not like ripping off the mic and running away or something. Okay, So I want to start by provoking, by asking, hasn't journalism, I mean, this whole question of is it journalism, is it activism, hasn't journalism always been essentially a form of social justice? I mean, think about Jacob Riis's photos of how the other half lives in the 1880s New York tenements, Upton Sinclair's writing about the meatpacking industry, Dorothea Lange and her photos of the Great Depression. So, I mean, how different is this? Journalism has always been about social justice. The civil rights movement, our own Nieman fellow here who showed his beautiful photos last night, Eli Reed, and beautiful pictures from the civil rights movement, and shocking pictures.
Well,
John.
I would say yes. The reason people go into journalism tends to be because they care about their community, their society. They want to tell the truth about it, and they want to tell truths that matter and things that advance the cause of making this a more perfect union. So comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable has been something that many people have lived by in the business of journalism. I don't think of that as activism. I think of that as truth-telling, and activism is what other people do with those truths. But yes, there is a I believe an underlying moral purpose to journalism, and we think about our society, we think about how to make it better, we think about the effect of what we do on other people. But to me, that's not politics, or that's not political activism.
So one of the things that provoked this was this young woman from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, who was the editor of the paper, was asked about this. And she said journalism is activism. I think she meant it in the same way that John just defined it, and yet she was sort of vilified by many people on social media who said journalism's not activism. I mean,
Well,
where do you see the line?
I mean, I think this is, in some ways, a sort of distinction without a difference. I mean, it is a question of what you declare at the outset your perspective is. For example, the idea of a crusading columnist. Nick Kristof is an opinion columnist. If he takes on an investigative issue, he's pursuing it from a declared perspective. And he investigates, the cause of how women are treated in certain parts of the world, and slavery and so on. So, I mean, he's coming from a perspective. Those same stories, I was once Nick's editor when I was on the foreign desk, could have been done by Nick Kristof, New York Times reporter, but they wouldn't have a declared perspective. So I think there's plenty of room, even in the sort of modern 21st century journalism, to either come from a perspective of this is our viewpoint, I declare that at the outset, or I'm going to do a sort of factual, ProPublica, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, whatever you want to call it, sort of thing where we try to have, I know that this word is hated, but neutral, objective, however you want to call it, where we don't hopefully come from a specific perspective, and yet the marshaling of the evidence is such that it prompts action. I mean, the whole idea of ProPublica is we'll do stories that will prompt change, and we don't specify the change in the stories, but clearly if they prompt change, that's activism, isn't it? Even though the story doesn't say, here's the last paragraph doesn't say, and here's what you should do. So I think, there's plenty of room in modern journalism to do both. And I just think you have to be honest about what you're doing.
Samhita, you represent a publication that, of course, came to a lot of prominence with the writing of Lauren Duca, and throughout the 2016 campaign and after, Teen Vogue has developed a whole new reputation beyond what it was before. And I'm wondering, is there also a generational aspect of this question? Do you see it any differently from what John and Steve have said?
Yeah, I think I do, only to the extent, I do agree that with your initial question, kind of journalism in its purest form is a type of activism, in that activism is the idea that when you see a truth about something and you know that truth, it inspires you to do something. And I do think in that sense, journalism is a form of activism, right? But it's not always true. And one of the very interesting and exciting things about Teen Vogue is, yes, young people are extremely engaged, and I hate when I just say young people, the ones that but we are seeing a lot of interest in political issues that are impacting their lives, and specifically around Parkland, and whether I consider what we do as inspiring activism or not, they're growing up in a time when media is extremely polarized, right? And so for them, they're like, oh, well, when people feel this way, they read Breitbart, like my uncle, and when I feel this way, I read Teen Vogue. And that's not necessarily something that I support, or I don't think we need to all become Breitbart of the left, but I do think there is something there where they're looking at, they're very identity focused, and I think just in general, social media makes it very like, what do I identify with? I look out there, and what is the content that I identify the most with? And so there is an interest in reading things that either reflect your worldview or help you understand, understand kind of social things that are happening that are impacting your life, but you may not have the language to kind of understand it.
So what you've just described, though, is something from the consumer point of view,
Yeah.
the product you're creating for your readers, the content they want to read. But I'm curious, what about your own staff and the freelancers you work with? What are the rules or lines, within which they need to operate, or are there no lines?
Yeah. No, there's definitely lines. I think I'm a little bit more conservative because I do come from more understand the lines of kind of journalism and opinion writing a little bit more. And there is something very special about a beauty brand that decides it wants to take on politics. Like there's a messiness, right? There's like a bit of a messiness to it where, a lot of my staff, they feel, and I also, I'm very invested in having a diverse staff. So many of the staff feel personally implicated in a lot of the things that they're seeing in the news. So they have a lot of strong feelings, whether they're the children of immigrants or they're young Black women or whatever. They feel very strongly. And I don't really, I don't feel it's my place to kind of curtail that experience. And I would almost disagree to say that like there's ever been a time that anyone's objective. Like I think people always bring themselves to the work that they do, and they always bring their own perspective to it. But my expectation is that they can have that perspective, but still be able to do their job. And so if you're a reporter, and you're a beat reporter, I don't want you marching at Black Lives Matter protests, because then when you go try and talk to the police commissioner, you're not going to be seen as a credible person to talk to. But if you're an opinion writer, I think it's okay if you go to the march. And, at the end of the day, my editors, they are people. They are not, my journalists are people, and they're living in a time where they feel really passionate about what's going on. And I'm not going to kind of moderate what they're doing outside of the job. What I say is don't let it interfere with what's expected on this job.
By the way, let me know when you want me to say something nasty so you have an excuse to get out the door. But I would like to react to one thing that she said, and it's not really disagreement, but it's a point that I think is significant, where she talked about the media being polarized. In the same way that people talk about the parties being polarized. One of the things that gives rise to the issue that we're talking about today is the fact, and it is a fact, that the polarization between the two parties is not symmetrical. It is asymmetrical. The Republican Party and the Democratic Party are not like one another. In the same way, as we heard this morning, the right-wing, so-called right-wing media and mainstream or even left-wing media, they are not alike. They are not mirror image analogs. One side has a much greater connection to reason, rationality, truth, facts than the other. And one of the things that makes people on the right upset with the media now is that many people in the media are calling this out and making this plain. And I think that is our job. That is not taking a side in an argument. It is telling the truth. So that, for example, if we're in a discussion of global warming and one side says, climate science says X, and the other side is a Republican senator from an oil state who walks on the floor of the Senate with a snowball and says, that can't be true. It's March and I've got a snowball. Those are not comparable arguments. And we need to not shrink from saying that, even if it upsets people who are kind of on the bullshit side of that argument.
Well, so I actually took a look at that Berkman Klein Center study that the professor was talking about this morning in the 90-minute Nieman, talking about the distinct ecosystems. And what was interesting is looking at it, he talks about this cluster from slightly right of center to moderate left, so sort of Wall Street Journal all the way to Mother Jones. And then he talks about the other cluster, which is Fox News to Breitbart to InfoWars. And he says that the first cluster, there's a policing system that you have to be accurate, and if you're not accurate, that everyone in your group will call you out, right? On the other system, it doesn't matter. All that it has to be is, do you meet the partisan message? Like, is the partisan ID there? Then yes, then it's replicated and truth is not an issue. So I was struck by the professor saying that neutrality, us trying to be neutral in this case, is in effect complicity, that we're merely amplifying lies. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, Steve, because I know you're old school in some ways.
Well, sure. I mean, first of all, to the point about so-called objectivity, which I completely agree with you, I think to say that we are going to employ actual human beings who are going to wake up with no opinions on the issues of the day is ridiculous. Every single person has a viewpoint and a perspective. It's one of the great arguments for newsroom diversity is to get a diversity of opinions. But what you said, which I also agree with, is it's how you do your job. And I think that is the fundamental question that you want to ask, not objective, neutral, whatever. It's, can you sort of look at the facts and fairly present them? And I do think we're surely in a point where if you read the Fox website as I do, you see an awful lot of strange things. But I will say this as a counterpoint. On the other hand, I read a story in the Washington Examiner like a month ago about the ins and outs of the Steele dossier, and this is quite an obsession in certain circles. I was just curious, why does the President of the United States tweeting the name Bruce Orr? Who the heck is Bruce Orr? Does anyone know who he is? Bruce Orr? Anybody know? Oh, good, a couple of people. So Bruce Orr is in the Justice Department, and he apparently was at some point in this process the sort of conduit of information from the Glenn Simpson GPS fusion investigation of the Russian stuff. And he was talking to the FBI, but it was kind of off the record, but there are 302 reports of this. And his wife was the chief researcher on the Russia project. So you go, wow, high Justice Department official, off the record contacts with the FBI, his wife, huh? And I gotta say, as an investigative reporter, I thought, like, this is a real story. And nobody did anything with it. And then about 3 weeks later, David Ignatius, God love him, said, look, I read this stuff, I know no one else does, but let me just go through it for you. And 1,500 words later, I was convinced it wasn't a story. But the point is, it took an opinion columnist. And I think that's a strange universe to live in, where we automatically say if something is over here and it's going down this same old road, well, forget about it. And so my concern, I suppose, is, yes, there are two ecosystems, but we need to be aware of the fact that you shouldn't dismiss anything out of hand, I don't think.
Well, all I would say on that is I think we don't dismiss those things out of fact. To me, that is an illustration of the asymmetry. When you have, and by the way, we saw, as we heard in the presentation this morning, a very clear demonstration of the power of the email story on Hillary Clinton. It was perfectly obvious throughout 2016, if you actually looked at the situation and what Hillary Clinton did and what others in similar position had done, that was a minor story. That was Hillary Clinton being selfish, being protective of information, and taking an alternative channel to send her communications. It was not about anything scandalous beyond that, beyond her. She's paranoid. She has a poor relationship with the press. But that story was built up to make it look like there was some sort of criminal conspiracy and that she was in serious jeopardy of being prosecuted, which was ridiculous. There was no shot that she committed a significant crime there, and it was obvious when you read the content of the emails. But the way that was treated as a balance, and largely because people thought Trump wasn't going to win, and so they were trying to show that they were being tough on her and all that stuff, that was a tremendous asymmetry. I think this stuff with Bruce Orr is another example of that. You've got the president on one side with a very long history of dependence on Russian money, express willingness of his senior-most people to cooperate with Russians on the use of information funneled from Russia, said out loud by them in their emails, dirty financial ties between the chairman of his campaign and pro-Putin oligarchs and forces in Ukraine. That weighed on one side, against on the other side, some kind of, incestuous Washington connections. The Fusion GPS is run by a couple of my former colleagues at the Wall Street Journal, and Bruce Orr's wife worked there for a while. And it's stuff that let's put it this way, it's weak tea compared to the stuff that is in plain sight on the other side. And so you have a president who is going out there and saying fake news and conflicted this and 17 angry Democrats. It's total horseshit. And that's the nature of the two sides. There's like a mountain, and then there's a little molehill.
I would like to ban the word fake news. I hate it so much because it initially meant something which was hoaxes and false, and it's been appropriated and repurposed and reinvented to mean something else, which is news I don't like news that is negative, that doesn't represent my political point of view. And so I would like to ban it from the conversation if we can. But it is a question of, I think part of the, not to go too deep into this polarization partisanship question, because we could have an entire discussion about that as well, but I think some of it is about certain media ecosystems, readers of those ecosystems, and even the purveyors, even the reporters, thinking liberal bias in the media. So obviously that's at the root of the problem, but I want to ask you, Samhita, everyone on this panel, we're all within 20 years of each other in age. And I think that, there are about, and I think that...
Don't let the blowout fool you. I'm older than I look.
I looked it up. That's how I know. And so, we were sort of raised in a certain notion of what is supposed to be journalism values. And one of those is this term that Steve threw out earlier, objectivity. And one thing that has always bothered me about that term is the question of the view from nowhere. Like, what is objectivity? We're not all, the view from nowhere is in a way a sort of privileged white male point of view is what it had been. Every person comes into a newsroom with their own life experience. So what does objective even mean? How do you see it in the context of your newsroom? You say you have a diverse newsroom.
I think to your point and what, I don't think that pure objectivity is possible. I just think that we are humans, we intake media, we have opinions, we have family histories. To me, diversity in newsroom is about, expanding the view from which you can tell these stories and the kind of knowledge and information that you start to uncover because you had a different kind of upbringing or you have a different position in this world. I think similarly, like when Orlando happened, I was, running a news desk that was actually focused on identity issues. It was called Identities under Madhulika Sika at Mike, and she, it was focused on issues of race, class, gender, and sexuality. And the desk was representative of the communities that we were reporting in, but it was a reporting desk. Like, we had opinion writers, but we were doing reporting. And when Orlando happened, I had a Latinx gay young reporter who could fly to Orlando, and he got really special stories because of that, and because of his kind of, when survivors, when their families saw him, and they saw him lined up next to other reporters, they felt more comfortable talking to him, right? Mm-hmm. And I still expect him to be able to tell that story. Obviously, it was emotional for him, it was difficult, but I expected him to both kind of power through that, get the story, and come back and tell the story. And that to me is, it's not about objectivity, and I think the pitfall that we risk when we focus too much on objectivity is keeping newsrooms, like, not letting them be diverse, right? And because we think that, oh, well, a woman can't report on sexual assault if she's a survivor because she's, like, relating to the story too much. And I think we need to kind of have faith in our reporters that they can actually do both, and that it opens you up to a possibility and a type of storytelling that someone who may not have had that experience have.
So Steve, I want to ask you, is it time for us then to retire the notion of objectivity? And I mean, if you think about it, this notion is in a way almost like a 65-year-old relic, and that's it. Because prior to, sorry, I'm not calling you a 65-year-old relic. I mean the notion of objectivity.
That was over the line.
Sorry. I meant in the sense
I find that very triggering.
I was like, don't let her drag you. No.
But right, until the 50s, we had partisan papers in this country, at least. We had the communist paper, we had the labor paper, we had the pro-business paper. There were all different kinds of papers for different political viewpoints. And this notion of sort of network news since the 1950s, fairness doctrine, all of that, and sort of mainstream media in a way is a more modern concept. Should we be retiring that and calling it something else, like impartiality or accuracy, something other than objectivity?
Well, or maybe fairness. I feel like, first of all, the sort of side door thing to that question is, well, why do we have to be fair? And, can't we just figure out what the truth is and just tell it? And I'm in the investigations world. I guess the first thing I would say is, if we're actually humble instead of arrogant, the notion that we're ever going to get to the truth of an event, we're going to know what really happened in a room, where there were 3 people present and 3 people have 3 different memories, is ridiculous. So we're doing approximations here. And if we're going to do an approximation of the truth and take our best shot, then I think we need to be intellectually fair. We need to be honest about what we don't know. We need to be honest about where the stuff comes from so that the reader can do critical thinking about it. And I'm not going to back down from that, even if it feels like I'm a 60-year-old relic. But the other thing I wanted just to point out in listening to John, because it is interesting in the so-called mainstream media, there are different ways to think about even the events with Hillary. I was in the New York Times Washington Bureau in the early 1990s. I had just come back from Poland, and my best friend was there, and colleague, investigative reporter, was a guy named Jeff Girth. And in 1993, he dragged me to Arkansas, where I covered the Whitewater scandal. And the first story I ever wrote on Hillary Clinton was about how she and the Rose Law Firm shredded all of her records right before Bill ran for president. And so that was my introduction to Hillary. So I did not find the story about the server to be necessarily inconsequential. I thought from a political perspective, it told me something about her character, which is that after all these years of being burned, hiding things about herself, her reaction was to triple down. And I thought that was relevant to the voters. So my perspective might be different from yours, even though we're both in the mainstream media.
No. I agree with you. I think that was revealing about her. And in fact, I remember interviewing her before she ran for president and asking whether or not she had so much accumulated scar tissue of distrust and paranoia and all that stuff that she couldn't effectively lead. And to me, the email story illustrated that.
Yeah.
What it did not illustrate was a national security threat or crime. If you looked at, the stuff that was in those emails, like the so-called national security stuff, was really lame. It was circulating, articles in the New York Times about stuff that was, covert, that was in the New York Times, and so you circulate an article. I remember talking to Republican staffers on the Intelligence Committee on the Hill about the small number of things that were classified that showed up in the emails that were bouncing around from her various aides, and they're like, yeah, that happens when you're dealing with national security stuff. When you're on the non-classified side, it's called leakage, and we audit those things, and everybody counts up. The point is, that was a routine kind of bit of business. But because it was associated with a presidential candidate who had the characteristics that Steve is talking about, it somehow got inflated into something much bigger. And the bottom line was, as James Comey came out at the end in that press conference, it was not a close call. This was not a national security crime. It was an example of a characteristic that Steve is talking about. Let me just deal with the objectivity question. Like Steve, I don't wish to run away from the term objective. I do not think that so-called liberal bias in the media is a figment of anyone's imagination. It's correct for the reason that I said. If
people come into
people go
journalism.
into Wall Street to make money. That's what they care about. People who go into journalism for different reasons. So there's a moral onus in that. In addition to that, journalists are more secular than the general population. I think one of the biggest failures of diversity in journalism is we don't have very many religious people who are journalists, in addition to other kinds of diversity. I remember sitting around with my Nieman class talking about this issue, which I was sensitive to because my dad was the ombudsman for the Washington Post, and he was actually the first ombudsman at a major American newspaper, and he wrote a lot about media bias, and he thought it was real. And I remember asking people how many had voted for George H.W. Bush in the '88 election. This was fall of 1999. And nobody raised their hand, and it was like, are you kidding? And so I was like, yeah. I mean, journalists are left of center. But where we've gotten ourselves now is that the Republican Party has driven itself into a cul-de-sac that requires it to make arguments that that have become increasingly disconnected from fact and reason. Because of the nature of their coalition and the evolution of the modern world. And so the biggest source of bias, if you want to call it bias, but it governs the way journalists react, is one thing that all journalists have in common is they all went to college. There's hardly any journalists now who didn't go to college. Well, look at the division between the two parties right now. The Republican Party is increasingly reliant for the votes of people who did not go to college. And there's a different perspective that goes with that, and that's a real thing. It's just that if the bias has to do with reason, facts, and rationality, I think journalists have to be comfortable with that.
So you heard it here, folks. Elitism is real and liberal bias is real. Well, yes, I do want you to add to that, but I also want to just circle back a little bit on this question of objectivity. I'm on the PBS Editorial Standards Committee, and we spent a year redoing the editorial standards for PBS, which is a huge process because it affects not just PBS NewsHour, but actually Big Bird and everything. And
You should be objective above all else.
And we did eliminate, at my pushing, we eliminated the word objectivity and we placed it with fairness and accuracy as other tenets, because I feel strongly that the word objectivity doesn't really make sense. I think you can be fair and you must be fair and you must be accurate, but objective to whom? Like, what is that? And I want to ask you about the criticism that the media has come under in the last year, 2 years, about both sides journalism, the sort of false equivalence. I know you want to also respond to something John
Right.
said.
I think, similar to this, I have been feeling this tremendous pressure. I am less concerned about my editors being objective or fair or accurate because I can be there, I can manage that. But stories take on a life of their own now. And I think to your point about the Hillary email story, it became something else on social media. And so we can, we have very serious fact-checking process at Condé. It's not, we're not just like, we'll just throw it out there next to the nail polish story and it's fine. Like we do serious reporting and, and have like an amazing research desk and are always asking these questions. And I'm always pushing, a lot of my editors, they're young, they're in their 20s, they think social media is everything, they think it's the public square, and in many ways it is. And they're afraid to say certain things because of groupthink and because of the way that certain things will be perceived or what will happen to them or their writer or to the brand. And to me, that's where a lot of this conversation needs, that's where it's going a little bit, because we can tell these stories, but I feel this tremendous responsibility of what will happen when that story goes out there. And I don't know if that's something an editor 20 years ago necessarily was afraid of in the same way.
So social media is so much a piece of this.
Yeah.
And it is also, even when we don't mean to, our personalities do come out on social media. And I have to say, I don't know if you all felt this, but when I was actually kind of dragged on, my friends in the audience who know that I'm a Twitter addict will laugh at this concept, but I was actually dragged kicking and screaming onto Twitter. I didn't want to be on Twitter. I was afraid of saying anything that could be perceived in any way as not an objective reporter. And Bloomberg insisted, because I was doing Bloomberg TV also, and they wanted everyone to be a personality and like show something of yourself. Well, the more you go down that path of branding yourself and showing your personality, the more your real personality comes out, and you start saying things that, even if you're a reporter, are tinged with opinion. And so how do you manage that? I mean, you have a huge
I think you got to be very
staff.
careful of it. I mean, the Times had an interesting and somewhat embarrassing example of this recently. Their very, very good reporter, Emily Bazelon, had tweeted some very clear things about her feelings about Kavanaugh, which is fine. She's a magazine writer and an op-ed columnist. They then put her on a news story. I don't think you can do that. What I tell my people about this is one of the sort of costs of tweeting strong opinions about something is you can't then cover it.
But that was an accident of circumstance. She lives in New Haven, apparently, or she was in New Haven, and they don't have a New Haven bureau. So they asked her to do it.
I kind of smile at this. I'm from New England. I'm not a New Yorker. But honestly, guys, 229 West 43rd Street to New Haven is an hour and 10-minute drive. So, like, they made it sound like it was, we didn't have anybody in Ouagadougou. What are we going to do? New Haven, oh my God, we had to leave Manhattan. I mean, come on. Come on.
Well, you know what?
Ridiculous.
So this brings us back to another point, which is real, though, which is the pressure to be first and to be fast. You know, fast, furious, first. And so it's like, yeah, maybe it would have taken an hour and 10 minutes to get someone to New Haven, but if she's already there, you can imagine them saying, oh, Emily, she knows legal stuff. I think she's even a lawyer. Like, you know, get her to do that.
Yeah,
And
I think it's at that point, honestly, up to Emily to remember what she said on Twitter. And there are people who don't do this as actively as some. You know, I once asked David Remnick this question. I said, how come you're not on Twitter? And he said, because I like to multitask, and sooner or later I'm going to do something really stupid. Mm-hmm. And you know, I'm on Twitter, and I'm mostly, you know, retweeting and terrified all the time that I'm going to screw it up. I mean, I just think, like, you know, this is really tricky stuff, and I understand that there is this sense that if you don't express sort of strong viewpoint, you're not going to be a Twitter character. But then, how do you then turn around and say, yeah, I call him as I see him?
well, I mean, I think John is a great example of this because John does stick to the facts. We follow each other very actively on Twitter. And what you do, and I think this is really interesting, is you will take something that the president said or that Mitch McConnell or someone said, and you will dissect it, and you will show how it is not true. Now, I could argue, and I have argued, that journalism is not stenography. And if we simply just quote what the president or someone else says, and we just put it out there as a headline or the lead, most people are not going to read to the fifth paragraph where we fact check it, or read to the bottom. And what they're going to remember is the headline that is the lie. The headline that, by the way, NBC said the other day that was, President Trump directly accuses Hillary Clinton of colluding with the Russians in 2016. That was the headline. So it makes it sound like, oh, maybe she did that, as opposed to this is completely made up. So journalism isn't stenography. You break it down and you say, no, this is why it's false. In this case, it was your employer, so that might have been a little bit tricky. But you then, in turn, get accused of putting out opinions. People say, oh, John Harwood, he's being lefty, even though what you're really doing is fact-checking.
Right, and I don't care about that criticism when we're talking about putting facts out, and that's the asymmetry that I'm talking about. There's a whole lot of stuff coming out of the Republican Party that's not based in fact. And so, for example, you had the administration claiming from the beginning, through the campaign, that it was going to propose a tax plan that did not provide any tax cuts to people at the top. None. Not just less than people in the middle, but none. They continued to maintain that all the way through. Every single economist who analyzed their plan said it was not true. But they kept saying it. Mm-hmm. So you point that out, and people say, God, you're so negative about their tax plan. No, I'm telling the truth about their tax plan. The same thing with and by the way, it's not just Trump. We had a debate, CNBC had a debate of Republican presidential candidates 3 years ago. And I was stunned at the willingness of so many people on the stage to straight up lie in response to questions. So one of my colleagues asked Ben Carson why he had been promoting like a quack diabetes cure or something like that. He said, I didn't do that. And he was on their website, okay? One of my colleagues asked Donald Trump, why did you say so-and-so about Mark Zuckerberg? I said, I never said that. It was on his website at that moment. I asked Marco Rubio what he was the candidate of the sort of Walmart Republicans. He was saying, and I said, well, how come your tax plan, if you look at how it's analyzed, even by the most sympathetic authorities, gives higher tax breaks to people at the top by a lot than people in the middle. He said, that's not true. I said, it is true. I read it to him.
All right,
And
but here's the problem with this.
So when you point that stuff out, you know.
You get accused of being a partisan.
Right, and I don't care about that because I am not going to shrink from those facts for the purpose of making other people think I'm being fair to them.
Right.
It's
Well,
not.
this is the both sides journalism that gets
Right.
criticized. And I mean, again, I wonder whether, you know, should we be activists for the truth? That's kind of our job. Our number one job is to tell the truth and whatever the consequences are. But we are in an asymmetrical environment where if you're telling the truth, you're seen as being biased. My issue is we shouldn't be amplifying lies, I think. But I want, you know, I really don't think we should be amplifying lies, but then again, we get accused of being partisan. So, Steve, I want to ask you, are there some issues here that have already been litigated? Like, haven't we litigated that, you know, all races are equal, women are equal, LGBT rights? So why is taking a position on those of saying like, yes, I'm in favor of women's rights, yes, I think people are equal, why is that something that is banned in some newsrooms? I know this because when I was at Poynter, I went to newsrooms and had to counsel people as the ethics counselor, where old school news editors were like, come in here and tell my people not to put that on Twitter. And I said, I'm not going to tell them not to put, you shouldn't shoot black people on Twitter. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not going to tell them not to say that. But so we did come up with some stuff where I said, I think some things are human rights issues. Like, you can tell your reporters, yes, you can tell your reporters, don't put something for a Democratic candidate, or maybe don't put something against the NRA. I mean, you know, whatever. But some things are just human rights issues. Would you allow your reporters to make statements like, no, they're not good people on both sides of the neo-Nazi debate?
Sure. I mean, come on. You know, and I don't think this is actually, you know, a tremendous problem. I don't think that that's the issue. To me, the larger, more interesting question is where you get out to the point about repeating lies, right? So, you know, we have done intense coverage of the neo-Nazi movement over the last year. And, you know, we've had an internal debate about to what extent are you, when you cover this group, are you giving it more oxygen? Is the very coverage of the lies and the outrage and the extraordinary racism, is that a mistake? And I actually don't think that it is. But now here, interesting how, you know, journalists come from certain backgrounds, certain opinions. So I'm a first-generation American. My father was a refugee from Nazi Germany. So, you know, I think undercovering the rise of Nazis was something I personally feel is a bad idea. Other people, you know, other journalists sitting in my chair might not feel that as viscerally. So, you know, but I think you got to sort of balance that. You know, when Trump stood up the other day and said something that I think hasn't even been covered. Correct me if I'm wrong, John, because I may have lost a half a day here somewhere. But he said at a rally, every Democratic member of the Senate has signed up to a bill called Make Our Borders Open bill.
Yes, that was covered as a complete lie.
Yeah, it's a complete lie. But the fact that the President of the United States says that, I don't think we should ignore it. I don't think we should say, well, that's a lie, why do we have to cover it? But I think we have to say, the President of the United States is lying at the top of his lungs, and there's no such bill, and we need to say that, and that's a story. And I think one of the things that he has said pretty openly, or it was quoted today, he wants to, quote, flood the zone, or as Stephen Bannon put it, flood the zone with shit. And that's how you deal with the media. And I think it's our job to keep up with that and call him each and every time that he does it.
And to be fair, the president says fewer things that are true than that are not true.
That's true.
Well, this
And
is
that's-
what Glenn
that's
Kessler has
pretty-
proven with the
No,
Washington Post fact checker.
No,
it's like averaging like 9 false and misleading statements per day.
Averaging 9, but he's had days of 100, so
Well, I mean,
he has
but
his ups.
let me ask you, Steve, there are some people who suggest that we need to then write our stories in a different way, that the old traditional way we have of writing stories is potentially outdated. George Lakoff, the Berkeley linguist, Maria Konnikova in the New Yorker, other people have argued that the human brain can only hold so many thoughts. So that's the idea that we hear a headline, and even if there's a fact check, fact checking can amplify and repeat the lie, and that the other way to do it is the so-called truth sandwich, to state what is the fact, then state what some politicians said that's a lie, and then restate the fact, and that's a better way to write a story so that people understand what's actually true. What do you think about that? Because it would mean a sort of upending of the way we do journalism.
You know, I've always been very suspicious of formulas. When people said write in an inverted pyramid, I said, oh my God, that's so dumb. You know, and I think we all agree it's really dumb. So I'm a little, I mean, look, I saw the other day, I think it was CNN or somebody, they had these, you know, the cryons or whatever, and somebody said, you know, after mocking Dr. Blasey Ford, White House says Trump didn't mock Blasey Ford, you know? And that was one sentence. You didn't need any sandwich for that.
CNN is famous for that.
Yeah, I mean, somebody's having some fun there. But, you know, I mean, I think, yes, we have to call them in a way that, you know, in this time-starved place, society we live in, where people are reading tweets, 140 characters, headlines, they get the essence of the story. Now, however you do that, I think that's the goal. I think the sort of specific techniques can vary from, you know, story to story. But yeah, the goal ought to be that even at a glance, you get the point. There is no bill to open the borders that Democrats are sponsoring. That has to come through.
Before we go to audience questions, I just want to ask you, Steve, because you have a unique perspective at ProPublica of sometimes having partnerships with outside organizations that give money to nonprofit journalism. I'm now have entered this realm as of a month ago in the Pulitzer Center. What do you do when you have a reporting partnership with like the AARP? And they are actually, I think, a registered lobbying group, an advocacy.
Yeah,
what do you do when they're funding?
We've never worked with a group that fits that description yet, and I think we would be pretty reluctant to. I think this is, you know, there's a whole conversation about sort of nonprofit journalism, and people say, oh my God, you're getting money from people who have opinions. It's so much worse than when Ford Motor Company and the defense industry funded your publication. I said, well, okay. They had opinions too. And I think in both examples, the point is, first of all, number one, look at the editorial independence of the product. Are there firewalls between the people who give and the people who do, the journalism and the people who set the agenda? And then I do think at some point, yes, an advocacy organization, from my perspective, is not an appropriate publishing partner. And so we have not, to this date, done that. You know, I mean, I think we have donors who have opinions. If you look up our donor list and you look at the Democratic Party donor list, you'll find some overlap.
Fair enough. Oh, yes.
I'd just like to make one more just interjection, which is that I think ProPublica is one of the greatest things that's happened to journalism in my career.
Well, thank you, John.
Absolutely. And it set a real example for other fantastic nonprofit journalism, investigative journalism in other places. I also love the Texas Tribune, which is like a mini,
very good.
A mini version.
And I will say one other thing that we have tried to practice. I think, you know, in terms of all of this stuff, radical transparency, once you get used to it, is actually not so painful. If you are actually, you can level with your audience. They're not going to fall on the floor in a dead faint. We actually made a terrible mistake about 8-9 months ago, and we ran a lengthy explanation of why we made a mistake, and we owned up to it. And you know, I'm still breathing.
Well, I actually think radical transparency from the front end is even better, and I really hugely shout out to the Washington Post, to Steve Ginsburg, one of the political editors there, and the whole series they did on Roy Moore. And what I love about this, and I've written about this, is in their very first story about Roy Moore, the series that won the Pulitzer for them, they had this very fat paragraph in which they said, how did we get this story? Initially, we sent a reporter down, and she was going to be talking about in Alabama about Trump voters, but then she heard this story about Roy Moore. Then she found these women independently. They didn't know each other. We didn't pay for it. It was like a whole explanation of the process of journalism. I think that is vitally important because ordinary, smart people who don't happen to be journalists do not understand how we do our job. They don't understand that anonymous sources are not anonymous to us. I've had so many people say to me, how can we trust you with your anonymous sources? You don't even know who they are. I'm like, that's not what an anonymous source is. But people literally think that someone's calling us up on the phone with a sock over the phone and like mumbling something and we're writing it up. So I am really an evangelist for we need to put process into our story so it's baked in and people understand how we get it, and that's how people are going to trust us more. So I hope you're all doing that. I think transparency equals trust, and that's how we're going to rebuild and restore trust in journalism. And we could have a whole other conversation about how some people never trusted us, like minority communities, and what do we have to do to build trust, not just restore it. But let's open it up so all of these wonderful, smart people can ask questions. And I hope that someone who is an overseas Nieman, because half of the Niemans are from abroad, I hope some of them will ask questions about how this relates to their own countries. And because we're quite privileged to have this debate even in the way we're doing it. So the ladies got the ball there. Go for it.
Okay, this is how this works. We're gonna you just take the catch box, ask your question, and then throw it wherever the next question is.
Wow.
Not injure you.
I like that.
Not be afraid.
It's fun. The crash box.
Baseball game.
The crash box. And tell us who you are and what country you're from or what year Nieman you are.
My name is Beena Sarwar. I'm
Hi, Beena.
Nieman 2006 from Pakistan. I live in Cambridge now. For the last few years I've been here. And it's good to see a few South Asians here. But my kind of comment is that you're discovering this journalism, activism stuff now. We've been doing it for years because
journalism, activism.
Sorry, did I not say that clearly?
Speak up a little bit.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
So
It's kind of
you're saying we're discovering that journalism and activism.
I'm saying that in countries where we have lived under despotic rules, military dictatorships, all kinds of non-democracies or democracies pretending to be democracies, we haven't had the luxury of objectivity. We've never been, you cannot sit on the fence. Right. And you are learning that now because now you have, I'm sorry, a close to fascist person in power. What I want to say is that I want to avoid using those labels. I, as an activist, and I teach journalism now, I teach foundations of journalism, and as I'm teaching my students, I'm realizing that my activism actually in journalism, I have to temper it by not labeling and name calling. So I don't know how to do that. I mean, I don't know how to not call a fascist, but I mean, it's something that I thought the conversation was really thought-provoking, but I guess the international Niemans here know a lot of this already.
Yeah. That's scary. That's scary. Thank you. Do you want to throw it down?
Yeah, right down here.
Throw it down.
Oh!
Oh!
Yes,
Let's try not to kill
releases for the
anyone.
audience.
Michael has a question here. All right, maybe we should walk the crash box instead of throwing it. No more crash box. Michael?
This looks like every newsroom softball game ever.
That's true. So true. That's why we're journalists and not baseball.
Hello.
Cannot catch. That is true.
I think my colleague
do you
in
want to
the
introduce
United
yourself
States
and your
will more
country?
and more, to
Michael,
understand.
do you want to introduce yourself and your country?
Yeah,
People
I'm
don't know
from
you?
China. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think my colleague in the United States is more and more close to understand the situation in China. because the self-censorship thing, we just practice for generations. So we know exactly even before Trump become the president, we already practice some skill. Now your guys doing in DC or in New York. I think that's the point. So I want to say, but it's not my question. My question is say, I think it's relevant to the first speech of this morning. When he said, actually now content is not important. The numbers of people and the network effect is more important than people. Because the number one issue in 2016 is not about mainstream media, whether it's good or not. It's disconnection. New York Times cannot deliver the news to the Central America. That's the problem. That means if you can only send the news to the small portion of the people, whatever you do, it doesn't matter, right? So, but we come up with the very strange thing. When you try to, expand your readership to more, people, you also at the same time should reduce the quality or the complexity of the news. You cannot do both. You cannot say, I will do the best and transparent and also very objective news, but also not driving people out. No. I just talked to my friend of New York Times this time. If New York Times try to use the first professor said to expand more people, you will become US Today. I didn't say US Today is not good, but you are no more New York Times. Because the people, sometimes read New York Times, you should at least like college degree, right? But US Today is based on the high school, the education system. I think that's the problem. At the same time, as a democratic journalist, we want to serve as many people, as many voted people of the country. But at the same time, I also want this news is more qualified. How can you solve this problem? I think because we already in China now have the problem. We want to serve more people because people read the free news in the WeChat. But once we try to expand that, because our news is really want to double check, fact checking, and also want to make things very close to the truth, people avoid reading that. They want to read more sentimental news. How can you solve the problem?
Thank you. Does anyone want to comment on that? Or
Well, I mean,
Yeah, we can.
I think you've got some issues there.
Samhita?
Yeah, just to crystallize the question, I think it's really, like, we can fact check till we're blue in the face, but if people aren't reading it, it doesn't matter, right?
Yep.
I think in some, and I was thinking that a little bit, but when you were talking about how it's important for us, like why we have to fact check, specifically Trump saying to an audience of people and everyone cheering that the Democrats have all signed on to this bill. The people that believe that don't read ProPublica, right? And it's going to be very hard to get ProPublica to them. They believe the New York Times is fake news. And, I think many of the people that believe that may not read any of our outlets. I think I have the best shot because one of their kids might, right? Like one of their teen daughters might be reading Teen Vogue. And it's something that we think about all the time. And I think this question of like partisan outlets, to a certain extent, teens, and I've noticed this with my staff or anyone kind of younger than 25, they actually also really hate the Democrats. They're very skeptical of the Democratic Party as well, so it's not partisan. They just have these values like, I shouldn't go in debt for going to college. I deserve a job when I graduate. They have, and they are, I think that's why they liked Bernie Sanders so much, right? They're very values driven in that sense. And that's something I think about a lot in terms of the types of stories that we're telling and the types of political issues we take on, that it will have a resonance that goes beyond Trump or anti-Trump. And I don't know how successful we've been at that. Numbers are showing my highest trafficked post, this is crazy, for August, off the record, for the politics section was an explainer on what anarchy is, which was really interesting. And we've had a similar kind of success with explainers on socialism or explainers on what unions are and kind of issues that go beyond like one party or the other party. And I find that especially for young people that are so distrustful of government right now, they're so distrustful of institutional kind of anything, I find that those types of ways in are really resonating. The other.
Your next one you're going to have to do is one on that thing, the guy who tried to blow himself up to describe that thing where you have your leaders chosen at random.
Yes.
That's the next explainer you have to do. That whatever that is, someone can tell me. I forgot.
The next explainer. But our other biggest way in, and this is why I say I think I have the best shot of any of of many outlets of reaching these audiences, is pop culture, and the kind of interest that Americans in general have with pop culture and with celebrity. Our most kind of engaged content is about Riverdale. I don't know who watches Riverdale. The new 90210. And that my hope is that when we write about pop culture, people kind of come for the Riverdale, but they stay for some of the political coverage.
Great.
Yeah.
I saw somebody up there. Sorry.
The catch ball.
I won't be throwing this. I'm Betsy O'Donovan. I was a Nieman Fellow in 2013. Yeah. And I was a community journalism fellow. And actually, I have a question for another fellow who's sitting a little further up. But one of the things that really concerns me in this conversation is a level of contempt that I hear for people who were my neighbors. I'm from North Carolina. I've lived in conservative communities most of my life. A lot of the people I know are people who are consuming increasingly propagandized news, but they're not bad people. Mm-hmm. They're not inherently amoral people. They're people who are responding to fears and a deep sense of loss. I think we see that coverage a lot. My question is actually for Hotting Carter, who, Hotting, I'm sorry, I'm totally putting you on the spot, but because Hotting's experience was in the South during the Civil Rights era and speaking truth to communities that didn't really want to hear what was being said and what people had to say. And I think we don't really have a parallel for where we are in America now, but Hotting, I would be curious if you have anything to say about how community news organizations and journalists broadly should be grappling with connecting and building trust with audiences who have this sense that the media has contempt for them, which is the thing I keep hearing over and over and over from friends and former neighbors. Do you mind?
I was sitting here recognizing that there are 5 of us who were Nieman's 50 years and more ago, and thinking eventually that eventually we would be asked to do something besides pray to prove that we knew what that was once upon a time. No, I was, just to be very clear about it, the last thing from either objective or, in fact, altogether taken by the need for balance when dealing with the society in which I lived, which was the Mississippi of the old days, because there was no such thing as balance when it came to dealing with the kind of crap that was the standard political, in fact, cultural and social fare of the time. The other part, however, was, to go to your question, I also knew that as brilliant as I was on every subject, how as deserving of my opinion as everyone was, they also deserved to get a lot of other things which were called something closer to fact than opinion, and that some of them, if you hammered them enough with fact, would begin to understand that what was going on was not acceptable if they thought they were children of a certain myth and a mythology and a notion of a country or even a notion of religion. I was sitting here thinking about Dick Harwood and how we had bitten our heads off for part of this conversation, thinking we were, as usual, in the business of worshiping our navels while having this discussion, and thinking about what it was like when the days of Kovich as a news editor and not a Nieman curator, who would have bit your head off for half this conversation, on the belief that, in fact, it wasn't important what you thought and that you had to be heard about what you thought on Twitter. What was important was to try to get facts to the people you're serving, not with your all-important opinions, but with what's going on in the world. And I got to tell you, one of the problems right now is that we are surrounded by our own navels. We love it. There was a day that the Times, the Post, and everyone else piously told the world they would not allow their people to go on talk television, would not allow them. And I remember one by one as that broke away, And all of a sudden, those who most protested their virtue were on the Sunday morning shows. I never had any virtue. I believed that it was perfectly okay to be in the American tradition of journalism, which was always partisan. It was always involved. We had this little cute period from about 1930 until day before yesterday, in which there was some thing that you all grew up in and Nieman's loved to expound. But most of the time, American journalism was about positions and was about the last thing from objectivity. And you know what? The Republic not only survived, it thrived, came through a horrible period of terrible journalism, and going to your point, part of it was based on the idea that, in fact, in a big city, there ought to be 13 highly partisan newspapers instead of just 3. That is to say, Manhattan of the old days, in which the newspapers were crap for the most part, but offered enough variety that people could find that diversity all of you like to preach about. You know, we need a lot of involved journalism, but it has to be involved in such a way that those who are not in our little tight circle of certainties will think that somebody is talking to their truths as well.
I would just like to add one thing in response to my colleague from 2013. If you heard contempt for your neighbors, that is certainly not what I intended to convey, or I don't think my colleagues did either. I'm talking about contempt for bogus information being fed to those people. Mm-hmm. So I think it shows respect for those people, not contempt, to point out that MS-13 is not taking over vast swaths of the country, or we don't have hordes of criminal rapists coming across the border, or to point out that the tax cut that was sold in their name actually provided de minimis benefit to them, or to point out that the president is not bringing coal back. That's not happening. And numerous other ways in which there are a set of arguments being made to people that are not correct. And in fact, many of the people supporting President Trump are those who would be most grievously affected by his policies. I think an underlying driver, not the only one, but an underlying driver of the alienation that we're talking about is the decline of an economy where people with lower levels of education could make a good living readily out of high school. There is a global redistribution in which low-wage labor is being employed in other parts of the country, and other parts of the world. And so what's happening is a tremendous stratification of income in the United States, and there are people who correctly believe that that this economy is not working for them. And so accurate information about what may make their lives better is something that I think journalists are for and trying to encourage, and we're pushing back against stuff that they're being fed, which is not true.
Hi, I'm Alicia, class of 2015, and thanks. So honored to be part of the best class, thank you. So I just wanted to, this conversation, I think so many of us in this room have had it so many times. We've been a part of it. We've muted it. But the thing I feel like has been so central to, what Betsy just alluded to is, and Mr. Hotting just alluded to, is just the idea of how our journalism, particularly in an American context, started as partisan. And so with that thought and with that idea and how objectivity grew out of a very limited idea of whose stories were even relevant, and whose narrative was even worthy of telling, I'm curious how each of you would reimagine that fairness and accuracy in each of the contexts you work in today that might leave the journalists in the room with something to take back to their newsrooms.
Samhita, you want to start out?
Yeah, sure. So reimagining, I mean, I think first and foremost, my priority is to have a newsroom that reflects the diversity of America and the communities that we're reporting on. And that's, and then the second is to really, I think that when we talk about diversity in newsrooms, it's very much about the reporters. It's not about anyone at the senior levels, like editors, editorial directors, or even executive editor, and having, I think having that diversity at all ranks, because that allows for a opportunity for mentorship and making sure that journalists that may not have access to an amazing education like here is still getting the skills and the ability and still getting the mentorship they need to accurately and fairly tell these stories. And that's something that it's been an uphill battle to kind of like show the case why we need resources to do that, to actually both have the diversity that we need, but also make sure that they get the same type of rigorous training and kind of mentorship to effectively, flourish in those spaces.
All right, well, I fully agree with all of that, but I'll throw out one other sort of thought in terms of reimagining. I mean, I would urge anybody in the world of journalism to try to be open to ideas that are not familiar. And I'll give you sort of three examples, one quite strange that just came to mind listening to this. Example number one, looking at two of my former Oregonian colleagues. I was once at a news meeting at the Oregonian, which is headquartered in the People's Republic of Portland. And I looked out at a room of about 35 sort of editors at various levels, and I said, does anyone in here disagree with the statement that whatever the problem is, a government program is the answer? And everybody said, no, of course. Government programs and higher taxes are the answer to any social ill that you can think of. There is no. I said, not everybody who reads the paper, outside of Portland that is, agrees with this. It's interesting. So that is a perspective. Maybe it's not, example number two. Everybody said, hearing this comment about Bernie Sanders, reminded me, everybody during the campaign, the distilled mainstream media opinion about Bernie and his program is, oh my God, none of the numbers add up. Don't be ridiculous. What, Medicare for all plus free college tuition? How can we as a country afford that? It's ridiculous. I'll tell you what, if you took that tax cut that they just gave the billionaires and put all that money into it, am I wrong, John? You know the numbers better than I do. I think you could do a lot of the crazy stuff that Bernie was talking about, so that you really have a very constrained conversation in our country. It's not a conversation like you might have in Europe or elsewhere, which goes from a sort of real democratic socialism all the way over to pure wild capitalism. And we're basically from wild capitalism to pretty wild capitalism, yes. And that's our conversation.
That's right.
And so on the left or on the right, open your minds up. The last thing I just thought of listening to this conversation, I started thinking, God, the great example of this in our past history is McCarthyism. Here you have a guy standing up and saying, the American government, there are spies, I have the 200 names, and we all know the 200 names were nonsense, he didn't have any names. As I was sitting here thinking back to my period as an intelligence reporter, I said to myself, on the other hand, we now know the Russians had spies all over the government. So, what would the right balanced coverage of that issue have been in McCarthy's period? It certainly wouldn't have been to say, it's all lies, it's all bullshit, there's nothing more we need to say here, because actually we now know from the intercepts in the Russian files, there were some serious spies. The H-bomb design found its way to Moscow from America.
You're saying McCarthy got screwed?
Absolutely. Like Trump, McCarthy got screwed. McCarthy's totally wrong, but would the great journalists of that time have been able to sort of write a story that somehow said, McCarthy's completely full of it, but it's not that there's no problem ever. And that's a much more difficult story to write than, the Russians are, own the State Department, or there are no Russians.
I would just say I don't feel like I have an adequate answer to her question, because I'm not sure what a reimagining would produce. We're all prisoners of our own experience. We're all prisoners of our bias, our worldview. To me, our job as journalists is to try to be conscious of where we're coming from, try to understand a picture in full of the issue or subject we're talking about, fairly present legitimate arguments on all sides, while not crediting things that we know to be untrue. And, you know, I do not yearn for a partisan press or a more activist press. I am confident, kind of in the way that Hotting expressed, that if you present people the truth as best you can discern it, the society will evolve in the way it wants to evolve, and you would hope that it would evolve in a way that reflects what you consider, morally appropriate values. But I'm, you know, it's funny, you were talking about my Twitter feed, and Anne-Marie has as well. I don't express any normative opinions on issues at all. I don't say whether Social Security benefits are the right amount or should be higher or should be lower, but if somebody wants to cut them, I will explain that that's what they're doing. Or, the issue of what's the right level for the federal deficit. I don't take a position on that, but if the Trump administration, as it has and continues to, saying we aren't making the deficit increase with our tax cut, when it plainly is in real time in front of our face,
you're fact checking.
we let people know that.
So
Okay, can we ask one?
Yeah, I have a brief answer to that too, which is the American Press Institute has a program that's going on now called basically Deep Listening. And Jeff Sonderman, I can put you in touch with him if you're interested in that. And I think that part of it goes to really listening to communities, the communities that you cover. And I completely agree with what Samhita said and everyone has said, having diverse newsrooms and diversity of every kind across the political spectrum, across the educational spectrum, across the religious and values spectrum, I think is really important. And then deeply listening to communities and understanding what it is that they want covered. And the Trusting News Project that Joy Mayer and Lynn Walsh run has some absolutely fantastic resources about how you can build trust and listening with your communities by engaging them in a real way, not just talking at them. And I'm a big advocate of that, along with radical transparency. Yes.
My name is Kalpana Jain. I was a journalist in India for many, many years. And I'm from the class of 2009, so I have to say that, the best class ever. I want to come back to some of the international perspectives that my friend Bina started off with, and I want to first talk about just a little bit on what we've all faced it. Yes, we are the future. What we did during the emergency and how fairness, objectivity, accuracy was reflected by editors when the government tried to clamp down on the press. They actually had one day a front page which had nothing, and then an editorial that was just left blank with a black border. And that was just such a powerful message, you didn't have to say anything. But coming back to the point that I want to make here is, a lot of this has been talk about partisan politics and politics. A lot of us cover politics, but in a different way in covering issues. I cover a lot of, when I say social justice issues, I want to clarify it. Issues of very deep poverty, issues of HIV/AIDS, issues of children rotting in jails, issues of women dying, issues of, just desperation, helplessness, and the stories that we all cover as journalists. How do we show objectivity, and how do we turn away from those stories when you know that these 10 kids out there will die if you don't take some steps, which is just going and reporting on them? And I've heard a lot of my friends and colleagues say, well, you don't touch the story, you don't do anything, you just stand there and you report. I'm sorry, I'm a human being, and I'm in this because I feel something for them. And because I feel is why I'm a journalist and I can write on them. And I don't understand the sort of this thing about distance from the story out there, because you cannot have that if you're reporting on that story. So I don't know what are the comments here, but I'd love to know. I mean, that was my point.
Well, it doesn't feel like there are two sides to the issue of child poverty. I don't think anyone's in favor of child poverty. So I agree in that
two
respect.
points to that. I mean, one, in terms of this question of objectivity, just to be clear, my news organization was the one that got the tape of the kids being separated from their parents. So we never had a thought when we presented that to insert 5 fat paragraphs saying, but on the other hand, I mean, there is immigration that's illegal and these people are undocumented. I mean, no. So, I mean, I think sometimes the story, does not, quote, need balancing. The question you raised, though, is a really interesting one. We just published something relating to some horrible situation in Liberia involving a school for girls. And the people we were investigating came back and raised a question about the reporter, and they said, did you at some moment in the reporting ever say to the person you were interviewing who was in terrible straits that you might be able to know somebody who could help them? Because this was seen as like, the implication was we were bribing them with the offer of help, and that would be unethical in journalism. And, as it turned out, it hadn't been said anyway. But I must admit, I asked several of my colleagues at ProPublica as we were editing this, I said, and what if we did? Like, what if we did? What if we said to some 12-year-old who's selling herself on the street in Monrovia, Liberia, when this interview is over, I might know somebody who might be able to get you out from under this bridge. I don't know. I mean, is that wrong? Because from my opinion, I'm with you. I mean, I don't think reporters should just walk off then and say, well, I've got the quote I need. We're done here. But I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think there is a view in journalism ethics that would say, well, you can't give anyone any inducement, so how can you offer to help the 12-year-old?
Well, I mean, as you just put it, it wasn't an inducement, or it wouldn't have been had it happened, and it didn't happen. But had it happened, it wouldn't have been an inducement. It would have been like the person has done the interview, and now, I mean, I think plenty of journalists in this room, I'm sure, have interviewed people in dire straits and afterwards probably given them a phone number of a social service agency or something, which is maybe different than, I mean, they're not opening up their billfold and whipping out dollars. So I do think there is a distinction, and I do see, we're human beings first. I mean, do you remember the Pulitzer Prize winning or
Yes.
World Press Prize winning photograph of the baby and the vulture? And a lot of people said, oh, well, why didn't that guy move the baby first and took the picture? In fact, it was all within the grounds of a refugee camp. So it's not like the child was in the middle of nowhere. But that photographer, I mean, it's a more complicated story. He obviously had other issues as well, but ended up committing suicide later. And I think that there was a lot of pressure and pain from many journalists in this room can talk about PTSD from being in refugee camps and seeing people in terrible straits. So I think we agree
there
with you with what
there was
you
an
say.
incident involving the host of Revealed, and I saw this, who was at a march where somebody was being beaten up, and he just leapt in and tackled the guy. I don't know. I mean, so what? I mean, what, we're supposed to watch people get beaten? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I was just trying to think about that in the context of, say, the American Civil Rights Movement. When the guy, remember that famous picture in the Globe with the guy with the flagpole hitting the African American, did the photographer then tackle the guy, stop him from doing that? Or when my dad, covered civil rights protests or protests against civil rights in the South, did they intervene when people were spitting on, black kids walking into school in Little Rock? I don't think they did, and I guess I would, in most contexts, I would say they shouldn't. But those are hard calls, and mostly Americans, and I count myself among them, have had the luxury of practicing journalism in a relatively affluent, relatively safe society where there aren't that many life and death calls that journalists have to make in terms of what they're encountering on a day-to-day basis. But it's those are tough questions. I don't have great answers.
Do we have one short last question as we wrap up? This lady here.
Thank you. I'll try and make it short. I'm Pippa Green from class of 99 and from South Africa, the same country as the photographer who took the picture of the vulture and the bird, and who had been taking pictures of a lot of the uprisings before, which it had been very tough. So I have a question about anonymous sources, and I'll try and give like literally 40 seconds of context. But during apartheid, it was people fell on two sides easily. There was partisanship and there was unashamed partisanship in many respects, and the press was as divided as the society because there was a real wrong that was being done. In democracy, it's got more complicated, and the last decade has really seen a huge degree of corruption and looting by politicians from the public purse. And one of the really big things that has undermined the democracy is the destruction of the taxes, the revenue services. And one of the key players in that has been the biggest Sunday newspaper in the country, who a few years ago ran a series of stories on a so-called rogue unit, tax officials setting up brothels, spying on people, etc. When I read it, I wasn't involved in the story and I wasn't working for the newspaper. I immediately had suspicions because I knew a lot of the people. But what emerged that over 18 months they ran these stories, and all of those people were then kicked out of the revenue service by a new boss. It's emerged that the whole thing was false. The revenue service has collapsed. The president of the country had another job, being paid R1 million a month, and wasn't paying tax on it. So one of these officials had gone to ask him to settle his taxes. And there was widespread corruption all over. So the question is this: other journalists are now saying that the newspaper should go before the Judicial Commission and basically disclose their sources so that one could get to the bottom of this campaign. What do you do with anonymous sources who deliberately mislead you for political reasons or for reasons of corruption?
Wow, great question.
Well, I mean, I'm pretty clear on this myself, and I felt this. The New York Times will tell you the same thing, and we feel this way at ProPublica. The grant of anonymity is not a blanket immunity forever. It's a contract, I believe, between the journalist and the source. I'm going to ask you questions. You're going to ask for anonymity. I'm going to give you anonymity, but you're going to tell the truth. So if you tell me one thing on background and then stand up in public and start lying about it, our deal is off. We're done. And so I don't think you owe any duty ethically to people who, lie to you about fundamental things. So as far as I'm concerned, blow them up.
I agree 100%.
Yeah, absolutely. And this has happened recently. There have been some cases in the US where news organizations have exposed anonymous sources because the anonymous sources were found to be lying and misrepresenting. Please join me in thanking our fantastic panel and in absentia Samhita. Thank you so much.